Chapter 12, European Society in the Age of the Renaissance. Part 2, Art and Artist.
Artists are the least important people in the world, so whatever you do, don't be an artist, girl.
One of the main factors for this time period is the fact that you have this large group of patrons. Traditionally, it was the church, people like the Pope, and even some rulers that would sponsor artists to create a variety of works. What you see by the 15th century is that a number of wealthy merchant bankers also began to support the arts. This became a way for them to flaunt their newfound wealth. A particularly good example of this is Pope Julius II. He's the one who served after the Pope Alexander VI, which I mentioned in the last lecture. He commissioned the Florentine Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Vatican in the Sistine Chapel, and he would visit frequently. He would give a variety of suggestions and criticisms on this. Some patrons, though, just gave a very general description of what they want, and they left the artist to make whatever they felt like. But this, regardless of the patron's level of influence, it shows changing patterns of consumption amongst the wealthy elite. Nobles, particularly in these urban centers, are spending less and less of their money on military gear and more on these cultural artifacts to show their importance.
When you go teeth, long teeth.
There were many changes in artistic styles which the Renaissance was known for. The genre of individual portrait painting emerges. Renaissance portraits really showed human ideals, but were presented in a more realistic style. But the most famous change was the use of linear perspective and vanishing point. Filippo Brunelleschi is credited with first demonstrating this in the early 15th century. Brunelleschi demonstrated with illustrations of Florentine streets how the use of a horizon line and disappearing lines could create the illusion of three dimensions on a two-dimensional plane. These techniques would get incorporated into painting later on. Another artist well known during this time period is Donatello. His sculpture of David is seen as oftentimes an important starting point in Renaissance sculpture.
Well, there he is. Michelangelo's Dave.
David.
Donatello's was not the most famous statue of David, but it was an important subject for Renaissance sculptures. David was somewhat of a symbol for the city of Florence, who viewed itself as being sort of a David-like figure. And so you see many David sculptures that serve both a religious and civic purpose.
Super fun, happy side!
No, Dad.
And while the Renaissance certainly begins in Italy, it was not confined to that. Flemish painters, particularly artists like Jan van Eyck, were some of the first to use oil-based paintings and were considered the artistic equals of Italian painters of that era. Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg rendered the human form and natural world in intricate detail and designed mechanical devices that could assist artists in solving the problems of perspective. In the early 16th century, though, what we see is that the center of the art world is really going to shift from Florence to Rome. This is particularly aided by Renaissance popes like Alexander VI, Julian II, which spent huge sums of money to beautify the city. The artist Raphael.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles! Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles! Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles! Heroes in a half shell! Turtle power!
The artist Raphael became really the most sought-after artist in Europe. He oversaw a large workshop with many collaborators and writing treatises on philosophies of art in which he emphasized the importance of imitating nature and developing an orderly sequence of designs and proportion. Titian is a contemporary of Raphael, but he starts developing this artistic style known as mannerism.
Do you know what that means? Then let me teach you a lesson.
Which artists would sometimes distort figures, exaggerate musculatures, and heighten color to express emotion and drama more intently. This is seen in contrast to earlier Renaissance styles, which tended to focus on order and symmetry. Artists like Raphael and Titian began to be seen as
real men of genius.
But despite this view, painters and other artists were considered like artisans, which meant that there was an expectation for younger artists to train under the expertise of an older master. Beginning artists would spend years mastering their craft by copying drawings and paintings, learning how to prepare paint and materials, and by the 16th century, there would be books about design and composition. Some of these started as informal groups of younger artists who gathered in the evening, but these turned into formal artistic academies by the late 16th century. These academies were gendered. Women generally weren't allowed to participate, and women would serve as artists, but were often relegated to fields that were considered minor or decorative arts, like porcelain, textiles, and needlework.
I did not. Oh, hi, Mark.